Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Hamre. I'm the president of CSIS, and I'm just very honored to be able to have Senator Coons with us today to launch a very important discussion that we need to have in America. We're in a new phase in America where it's about our competitiveness, our ideas, the creativity of our environment, the foundation of protecting intellectual property that becomes a foundation for that. We're so grateful that Senator Coons is with us because he's been a champion on all of this in the Senate. His voice has been strong and clear, and we're so grateful that he's here with us today. He's dodging votes. There are votes on the floor of the Senate right now, and we're going to try to fit him in this little window. Senator Coons, thank you. We're so grateful that you're here.
Thank you, Dr. Hamre, and thank you to CSIS. And I'd like to extend a particular personal thank you to Andre Iancu, the immediate past director of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office and leader of the Renewing American Innovation Project and the host of this particular panel. I'm not dodging votes. I'm going to go back and actually vote. But I am briefly in my hideaway in between votes. So I'm literally just a few floors below the floor of the Senate. Look, I'm honored to have a chance to join this conversation about intellectual property and the essential role that strong IP rights, in particular patent rights, play in incentivizing, financing, accelerating the development of critical inventions. We are in the midst, hopefully the very late stages, of one of the worst public health crises our globe has seen in a century. And because of research and innovation, development and deployment, we've seen several safe and effective vaccines go from a conception to reality to now more than 200 million doses having been delivered here in the United States because of remarkable moonshot level delivery and development of an innovation in the vaccine space. In the United States, our intellectual property system was long considered the gold standard. But as Dr. Iancu and I know well, Director Iancu and I know well, we've seen some significant weakening of the quality of our IP protection system, and something that I'm very concerned about. IP rights are under both external and internal attack. And as someone who, I appreciate you recognizing this, Dr. Hamre, has long been a fierce and engaged advocate for strong IP rights, I'm really concerned about it. There is a move right now at the WTO by a number of countries, India and South Africa in particular, and some in our own country and some of my colleagues here in the Senate, to try and press for a broad waiver of IP rights, as if somehow IP rights have been a critical impediment to the availability of vaccines and therapeutics. Everything I've seen suggests that's not the case, that some of the barriers to scaling up manufacturing and distribution of vaccines and therapeutics at the scale and on the timeline the world needs are just that, barriers to manufacturing and distribution. And that the willingness of the key inventors and developers of mRNA vaccines and other vaccines and other therapeutics, their willingness to license and to manufacture or distribute at cost or as donations, these vital tools in the global war on this COVID pandemic suggest that it's not IP rights that are really centrally at issue. In fact, if anything, IP has enabled historic licensing and partnerships. Some of the IP waivers and some of the collaboration that's happened in the midst of this pandemic, I think points to the ways in which IP has actually not been a barrier, but a facilitator of critical cutting edge innovation. If we were to simply open up to the world all of the IP at the core of these groundbreaking developments, I think we would then be at risk of losing the private sector investment and development that's critical to this moment of personalized medicine, of breakthrough vaccines, of breakthrough medical diagnostics. And I think, frankly, the world would suffer as a result. So, as I said, I don't think that waiving IP rights will suddenly enable other countries the ability to ramp up the manufacturing of complex vaccines. Instead, I'm urging that the Biden administration and the private sector work together in a coordinated effort to manufacture, distribute, and administer vaccines rapidly and equitably globally. China is already doing things to strengthen their supply chain and address logistical challenges. The United States needs to do that as well. And one of the ways that we're doing that is legislation that was just introduced yesterday. Let me reference two pieces of that I think are important. One piece is the Innovation Centers Acceleration Act, something I reintroduced with Senator Durbin, something that's at the core of a piece of legislation I'm really excited about. Last year, China, for the first time, exceeded in their domestic R&D investment in the United States. And within the United States, there's just a handful of communities, Boston, Research Triangle, North Carolina, the San Francisco Bay Area, Seattle, San Diego, that account for 90% of all of our nation's innovation growth in the last decade. We cannot win the global competition for R&D and for innovation if it is so heavily concentrated. So the Innovation Centers Acceleration Act would invest significantly in designating and building out 9 other designated innovation centers around the country, places that have strong university and research footprints, places that have strong workforces, but that aren't really getting the access to capital that's needed for us to accelerate innovation in this country. I've been working with Senator Young and Senator Schumer to put key elements of that bill into the Endless Frontier Act. The Endless Frontier Act was introduced yesterday. It's got 14 bipartisan co-sponsors, an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, to dramatically increase investment in American R&D and regional economic competitiveness. It'll put $100 billion over 5 years to establish a technology and innovation directorate at the NSF. It'll put $10 billion into these regional technology hubs that I was talking about, and $2.4 billion into Manufacturing USA, a program that I've championed and that would be administered through NIST within Commerce. At the University of Delaware is one of the Manufacturing USA hubs that is about innovation in the manufacturing of biopharmaceuticals. Last, it would establish an Office of Supply Chain Resiliency and Crisis Response within Commerce. That's just one of a number of proposals, bills, and interventions I'm engaged in here in the Senate. Let me close by being optimistic about our ability to invest in innovation, science, and competitiveness here in the United States. If we look back at what happened when the Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite, it was a moment that was a genuine wake-up call for the American people. And as a result, Congress and the administration invested in STEM education, invested in research and in fundamental and applied science. And the benefits of that lasted for 2 generations. January 6th was a moment that was challenging, divisive, difficult for all of us here in Congress. And it was a wake-up call that our country is badly divided. And the ways in which China has become a peer competitor in investing in R&D, in the number of patents issued, the number of research papers published, and the ways in which they are now trying to take the lead in standard setting bodies. That recent campaign to put a Chinese national at the head of the WIPO, where the PTO director, Mrna Vaccine, did yeoman's work to make sure that someone committed to a strong intellectual property system globally instead became the head of the WIPO. All of this is a wake-up call for us that we need to have another Sputnik-like moment of reinvestment in American innovation and competitiveness. A central part of being successful in this competition is continuing with our constitutionally created protected property right of a patent, something I've long believed in, and I look forward to hearing how you're contributing to working to strengthen and sustain a competitive, strong global IP system, both here in the United States and around the world. So thank you, Dr. Hamre. Thank you to CSIS. And if you will forgive me, I need to run back upstairs and cast another vote.
Many senators simply represent their state, but a few senators lead the nation. You are a national leader. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much, Doctor. It's great being on with you.
Thank you. Let's turn to you, Andre. You've lined up such a remarkable program, and very anxious to hear your panelists and your thoughts here. I should say that now's the time to put in for a raise after that promotional. You should be walking on water by now.
Well, thank you very much, John, and I'm going to ask you to double my salary. Just multiply by 2, and we know what the end result of that will be. Well, no, thank you very much, John. And as I said beforehand, you really are a true leader, John, in this area. I'm so thankful about being able to work with you and the leadership that you've taken on this really important project about renewing American innovation. Let me start by thanking Senator Coons. I'm so incredibly thankful for him to take time out of the incredibly busy day in the middle of the day of voting for him to be with us. He really is a true leader on innovation and intellectual property issues in the United States. He is such a critically, as you've heard, he represents such a critically important, well-developed, knowledgeable, substantive voice when it in the discussion about innovation and intellectual property issues. Not only that, he really is a true friend and a champion of American innovation and IP. So just like he is optimistic, I am optimistic about innovation in the United States with leaders like Senator Coons. So once again, thank you to him and to his staff for making his appearance possible here today. Let me now turn the discussion to our panel. Let me introduce the panel. It's a remarkable panel. I would ask that all of them turn on their cameras, and I guess they are now. Okay, very good. We have 4 remarkable folks in the IP ecosystem, and each one of them with tremendous experience, different types of experiences that I hope can be brought to bear in what I am certain is going to be an extremely interesting discussion and a very timely discussion. But before I introduce them, let me just mention the topic here. Why are we talking about this right now? Just today, the United States reached 200 million doses of vaccine administered. Remarkable progress. We're basically about a year into this pandemic. Around the globe, more than 1 billion doses of vaccine have been delivered. The expectation is to get to about 2 billion by the end of next month, and almost 10 billion doses by the end of the year, probably enough to vaccinate the entire adult population around the globe. But the vast majority, at least, of the vaccines so far have gone to the most developed nations. Some, as we have heard from Senator Coons, some question whether that is ethical and what more can be done to deliver even more vaccines around the globe more quickly in a more equitable potential distribution. And some have called for the suspension of all IP rights, patents, copyrights, trade secrets, and so on. Around the world through a waiver of the TRIPS agreement at the WTO. So this and other similar issues will be discussed by our panel. First, we have Jayashri Wattal. Jayashri was a counselor on intellectual property at the World Trade Organization for a very long time, and now is a member of the board of the Medicine's Patent Pool. She's also a professor at the National Law University in New Delhi and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center. Among other things, she's also an author. She wrote a book on IP rights in the WTO and the developing countries. She's an editor of various handbooks, including the handbook on the WTO TRIPS agreement and the making of the TRIPS agreement. All that and more. Welcome, Jayashri. Next, we have Brian Zelinski. Brian is the Chief Patent Counsel at Pfizer, where he has been for nearly 3 decades. He began his current role in 2018, and prior to that, he served for almost 27 years as the Vice President and Assistant General Counsel with Pfizer. Next, we have Ed Bright, who comes to us from the venture capital world. He is the president and general counsel of the Exploramed incubator in Silicon Valley. He's also a co-founder of several companies, a patent attorney, and has served on the executive management teams of many startup companies in multiple capacities over the past 15 years. Prior to all that work, Eb was the director of IP for the West Coast operations at Guidant Corporation. Welcome, Brian, and welcome, Eb. And last but not least, Robert DeBaradine, who is the Chief Intellectual Property Counsel at Johnson & Johnson, where he's been for a number of years. Before that, he's got wide experience with a number of companies in industry, including as Chief IP Counsel for Sanofi and Chief IP Counsel for Abbott Laboratories. Welcome, Robert. So,
thank you, Andre.
Let me start with you, Robert. And I want to keep the first part of our discussion for you and the rest of the panelists at the high level to orient the audience as to the issues that are really important and relevant today. So first, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. What type of technology is it? And what types of innovation and are important too? What types of innovations have gone into that vaccine?
Yeah, thank you, Andre. And it's great to be here. And I would like to say that you know, the Senator Coons really hit everything spot on as far as, you know, where we are with IP. So you know, the reason we have a vaccine and it's been done in a year is because we had a vaccine platform that is proprietary. It's based upon a virus, based upon an adenovirus that is a carrier for genetic code that we're going to put into that carrier that's going to treat different disease states. And we can use that platform for trying to treat many different things, including influenza, you know, potentially hepatitis, other things like that. And the good thing about the patent system, as Senator Coons was alluding to, is that you know, Pfizer has a different platform, and AstraZeneca will have a different platform, and Moderna will have a different platform. So you have all these different platforms that are proprietary and developed because of the patent system, because of the large investment that goes into it. And so you have that broad platform upon which we're building. Then, of course, we had to take that platform and make it useful for the COVID-19 virus. And we did that obviously once we got the genetic code for the COVID-19 virus. Then you start playing with that so that your vaccine can be very specific for that viral problem. And so, of course, there's a lot of IP that goes into that. A lot of solving problems that need to be solved, formulations, manufacturing, you know, distribution, all these different things, supply chain that come into it. And that's what we've been doing over the last year, is sort of solving all those problems to take that sort of general platform and make it specific for COVID-19. Of course, the reason we can do it in a year is because we had it before, and we were relying upon a foundation that was built upon IP, and we've been using that to come up with our vaccine.
And when you say that you had the platform before COVID, is there an approximate amount of time? How long has the company been working on developing this platform?
Over a decade. Okay. You know, it's over a decade, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of investment, including, you know, expenditures plus scientists. I mean, numerous PhDs working on the problems that come into trying to come up with these platforms. And so, you know, it's been a huge investment over a long period of time.
All right, thanks, Robert. Let me go to Brian now and ask a similar question for Pfizer. If you could describe a little bit, Brian, the Pfizer platform. It is different, it's mRNA, but maybe you can explain a little bit what that is. And again, what types of IP do you have, generally speaking, within that, how long you've been working on it and the like?
Sure. Hi, everybody. So our platform and approach is somewhat different than J&J's. We have what's called an mRNA vaccine. I think people all know that by now. And what this vaccine does is it relies on the nucleotide, the mRNA, which goes into the patient and conveys information to the cells of the patient to produce an antigen. And this antigen is something that is like the virus, but it is not in any way the virus, that will instruct your body to elicit, it'll pull an immune response from the patient and create antibodies against the antigen, which will also be operational against the virus. So it's a cutting edge technology. It's a technology that we have been working on with our partner BioNTech for some time. And it's an add-on to the already extensive vaccine technology that we've built up at Pfizer through our efforts on Prevnar and other vaccines. But it's a technology that has never been commercialized. And yet we were able to, working with BioNTech, come up with a vaccine in less than a year that's proven to be 95% effective. And in the real world experience, at least 90% effective. So we're really excited about this. It's amazing that, frankly, I've been doing this for 25 years. I'm amazed that we've been able to do it in less than a year. But we're grateful for the IP system, which allowed us to develop the expertise to really rapidly deploy and create this vaccine at a commercial scale in that time period. We think that both of these vaccines and other vaccines are needed for patients. So we think that the IP system is critical in ensuring that these various technologies on different platforms all can be leveraged to create a portfolio of COVID-19 vaccines to be deployed around the world. This is essential. Patients need options for this. It's going to continue to mutate, and we're going to need all these options to vaccinate everybody in the world.
So Brian, just on the technology briefly, I've heard some people describe that with the mRNA vaccine, once it's introduced in the body becomes a little bit of a smaller and individualized vaccine factory, specific for the human, the specific patient. What does that mean? Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, actually it does. So the way it works is the vaccine actually, when it's injected into the patient, it instructs your cells to actually produce the antigen, which causes the immune response in your body. So your cells are actually doing the heavy lifting once we inject the vaccine. So it does. Your body ultimately becomes sort of the manufacturer of the antigen, which is critical to elicit the immune response that's needed. And it's working. It's working. We're very grateful.
And to contrast that a little bit with the traditional vaccines from the past, when the antigen is introduced either potentially as a dead form of the actual virus or a weakened form of the actual virus, which can take a long time and a big process to manufacture in sufficient quantities to deliver to everybody around who needs it, this allows the body itself to create those antigens, and you can avoid that intermediate step, right?
That's right. That's right. And it's very easily adaptable so that if, new variants emerge as they have, we're going to be able to adapt this technology to address those variants. And we're hard at work already trying to do that.
Now, this technology is not specific to COVID-19, right? It was developed well before COVID-19, and it has other potential applications, I suspect.
That's absolutely right. For example, we're working on a flu vaccine using the same technology, and we're hoping to address other infections and diseases as well using this technology. We see broad applicability for it, and we know our partner BioNTech also does as well.
All right, thank you very much. Let me remind the audience that if you have questions for the panel, please insert them into the Q&A that's available through Zoom. I'll try to get to some of them as they come up. And actually, before I let you go, I was going to go to Eb next. But before I do that, Brian, there is a question from the audience, if you can just very briefly touch on it, which asks, what part of the manufacturing process of mRNA is falls into the trade secret realm as opposed to potentially patent or something else?
Sure. So this has proven to be a very complicated process. We have approximately, I think, 280 components that are used in the manufacture of our mRNA vaccine, of which around 15 are actually novel raw materials that we have not, and to our knowledge, others have not used before. We have refined it over time such that our production now is to the scale of expected 100 million doses per month. To put that in context, we generally have been able to produce 200 million doses per year. So 100 million doses per month, which is what we expect by the summer, is really unprecedented for us. All of these changes give rise to many types of, different steps in innovations in every part of the manufacturing process, all of which we view as being confidential proprietary information. It's hard to catalog everything that we would put in the bucket of proprietary information, but it includes everything down to how you actually make the formulation, how you actually transport the materials, the types of things we call skids to transport the vaccines, really every single component. And yet we have actually shared this technology with partners to ensure that we can make enough product to have scale for worldwide supply. We are committing to making 2.5 billion doses this year and 3 billion doses next year. And we know that J&J is the same order of magnitude in terms of their production goals. And as you said, we expect to be able to, just between our two companies, have on the order of 6 billion doses next year. So this is going to require continued refinement. And I wish I had a list of every single part of it that we could think of as proprietary, but it's multiple parts, really hundreds. And it continues to change because we're continuing to refine it to make it much more efficient.
Okay. Thanks, Brian. Let me turn over to Eb Bright. Eb, why don't you talk to us a little bit from your unique perspective from the venture capital world and making investments in the healthcare industry in general. What role does IP protection have on that side of industry? Obviously, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson are large established companies, have been here for a long time. You deal probably a lot more with startups, initial investments and the like.
Yes, so it's a very different perspective from an investor standpoint, thinking about looking at early stage technology, investment in small companies, and trying to decide whether or not it's worthwhile to pursue a novel technology and a particular small company, or whether or not it's better to, if they're being a better fiduciary by putting their money into a more late stage or established technology. So in the rare circumstances that they do decide to make an investment in very early stage technology, a very small company, things to keep in mind are that they are investing in companies that have no other revenues coming into the company. So the only money that is supporting the company, paying the salaries, paying for all the research and development, paying for the acquisition of patents, is from their investment dollars. And that will continue on for many, many years, long, decades oftentimes, before they'll actually see a return on that investment. And so if they're going to make that investment in the early stage, and they're going to wait for many years before they actually see a return on the investment, they need to know that they're going to be able to keep others from quickly copying that technology once they have, shown by working with a small company that a technology works. So just to give an example, one of the companies that we started over a decade ago, it took nearly 14 years in order for that technology to be approved by the FDA and then subsequently to be paid for by health insurance plans or by CMS through the Medicare program. And during all of that process, it's a risky proposition because nobody else has proven, first of all, that the new product or the new procedure actually works, and or how well it works. And so everybody is sitting on the sidelines, waiting to see how the pioneering company does, how the technology performs in clinical studies, is it safe, and how effective is it? Once that's been established, most of these technologies are relatively easy to replicate, particularly in a lot of the investment world associated with medical devices. Once you see a procedure, you see a device, it's not too hard to replicate. And so you want to be able to have patent protection that prevents people from being able to be a really rapid, fast follower, making a much more smaller targeted investment to not have to go through all the hurdles that the startup company did and get to an approved device quickly.
Okay, thank you for that background, and we'll come back. I do want to explore a bit more about what would happen with private enterprise if IP rights are suspended. But let me first go to Jayashri. And you are a trade expert. Jayashri spent a long time at the WTO specifically on these issues of intellectual property. So first, before we get into any specific details of the current proposals, tell us a little bit about the TRIPS agreement. What was its purpose? First of all, what is it? What's its purpose? What does it cover? And the like.
Thank you so much, Andre. Thank you for inviting me onto this panel. So the TRIPS, the acronym TRIPS stands for Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. And what it is the single most comprehensive international treaty on intellectual property rights that obliges WTO members, now 164, to have minimum standards of protection and enforcement of intellectual property rights, such as the ones we've been talking about, patents in particular, but also copyright, trademarks, trade secrets, and test data protection, which is about clinical trial data. So the intellectual property rights, the purpose, of course, was really to improve the protection of intellectual property rights the world over. These negotiations on the TRIPS agreement were initiated in the Trade Forum, which was GATT before the WTO, in the mid-1980s, led by those who owned most of the world's intellectual property at that time, the United States. And I represented India in those negotiations at that time. It was very hard, to push back against the inclusion of pharmaceutical products, which were considered extremely important. Patents are considered particularly important, or uniquely important, I would say, for the pharmaceutical sector. And at that time, India had excluded such medicines from patent coverage. But we did succeed in some respect to get some provisions or policy instruments included into the TRIPS agreement. So the TRIPS agreement also, in addition to the minimum standards of protection and enforcement, includes or allows for certain exceptions and limitations to intellectual property rights. For example, the issuance of compulsory licenses for on any grounds whatsoever to third parties without even the authorization of the patent owner. And such compulsory licenses can also be issued 100% for export of patented pharmaceuticals to other members of the WTO that do not have the capacity to make them. So this, I would say, is a short introduction. There's only one point I would like to add on trade secrets, because some in the audience seem to be interested, that the protection in the TRIPS agreement and in national legislations on trade secrets is only against theft or acquisition of trade secrets by dishonest means, and that there is no protection, unlike in the case of patents, against independent discovery of the protected products or processes.
Thanks for the background. Super interesting. You mentioned that at the beginning, India was pushing back against protections on IP protections on pharmaceuticals and the like. But there is a provision in TRIPS that calls for non-discrimination among industries, right? Can you talk briefly about that?
Yes, so this is a provision in the patents section. There is a requirement not to discriminate across fields of technology or between fields of technology in the availability and the use of patent rights. So this means that no country can do what India did for many years, which is exclude only one or some fields of technology, such as medicines. And so that cannot be done, nor can you discriminate in the use of intellectual property right or the enjoyment of intellectual property rights, such as having a specific provision, for instance, special compulsory licenses or licenses of right, as it was called in the Indian law, targeting only patented pharmaceuticals. So that is no longer allowed for those who are members of the World Trade Organization.
Okay. Now, there is, as we mentioned in the intro, there is a current proposal actually by India and South Africa, but quite a few other countries have consented to this proposal to suspend or to waive intellectual property rights for COVID-19 related technologies. Can you describe this waiver proposal and what's it meant to do?
Yes, so the proposal was submitted October last year by South Africa and India. And that proposal wanted a temporary waiver of TRIPS obligations related to not just patents, but also copyright, industrial designs, trade secrets, and test data protection for the duration of the COVID-19 pandemic until widespread global immunity has been achieved. So that is the proposal. Now there are about 60 members of the WTO who are proponents and many other supporters who argue that such a waiver on intellectual property rights, such a broad waiver on intellectual property, would facilitate the prevention, the containment, and the treatment of COVID-19. In particular, they argue that it would accelerate an equitable spread in the production and distribution of COVID-related vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and other related products, as many more producers in low and middle income countries could start producing them. They argue the policy options. If I may? Okay.
Yeah, Jayashri, let me ask quickly on that point. Why is that? Why is that needed? Because you mentioned just a couple of minutes ago that already TRIPS has within its agreed upon framework limitations and exceptions such as compulsory licenses. So why do we need this additional thing?
Yes, thank you. That was exactly my next point, which is that the proponents of the waiver proposal, they basically view compulsory licenses as being difficult to implement. There are political difficulties in implementing such a policy instrument, country by country, and hence they believe that the general waiver of intellectual property rights, which would be applicable to all WTO members, would be helpful.
Okay, well, thank you for the background. Super interesting. Let me now go back to Robert from J&J and ask you, what do you think about the waiver proposal, and what would it do to the production and dissemination of vaccines right now? I mean, folks are arguing that we're in a crisis, worldwide crisis, that it's a once in a century type of a situation. So would such a waiver work to help distribute more vaccines more equitably around the world and more quickly?
Thank you, Andre. No, it wouldn't, of course. Brian has talked a lot about it. I think of this in terms of a recipe. And if you're trying to duplicate a recipe, if you're trying to make cookies like your grandmother or your aunt, or my grandmother was the best cook in my family, I could try to follow that recipe I could do it for 1,000 days and it would never come out right. It wouldn't taste like grandma's cookies. And, so the idea that by just licensing IP, giving IP away, that people are going to be able to get the right ingredients, be able to put those ingredients together in the right way, be able to cook those ingredients in the right way, be able to cool those ingredients in the right way, and be able to distribute them with the love and the hugs that grandma does, it's just not going to happen. And right now, the biggest problem that we're having is really infrastructure issues. We can make, to Brian's point again, people are making hundreds of millions, and there will be billions of these vaccines available across many different manufacturers. And again, that's one of the beauties of the IP system, is we have so much choice. But the real problem is going to be, how do you make it? How do you get these products, and how do you make it available to people? And there's a lot of there's healthcare infrastructure, there's medical personnel infrastructure, there's supply issues, cold chain, there is education, patient education. So there are many steps about getting access to a medicine to people. And in the case of the COVID-19 vaccines, the issue is not with IP. The issue is a lot of infrastructure issues, including supply chain, manufacturer, ingredient issues that will not be solved by killing IP. The other thing is this: if you wanted to take the Pfizer vaccine or the J&J vaccine or the Mrna vaccine and have them try to educate someone on how to make that vaccine, it would stop the supply of those vaccines. And you only have so many people that know how to do this. And right now, again, we're making enough of the product to get to people. If you want to stop making that product to teach other people, you'll have delays in getting those products out to people as well.
But let me push back just a little bit on a couple of these points. The argument is that you have the recipe, the cookie making recipe, and everything that grandma needs to put in there. It's within your field of knowledge. Why not just you don't have to use your own people because you're busy doing your own stuff. But that's the point. Why don't you just take the blueprints, take the cookbook, take the recipe, and just give it to potentially idle vaccine factories in other countries around the world and let them go do it.
Yeah, but it's again, the problem is, the safety. Can they do it? Will they be able to do it and create a safe and effective vaccine? In fact, if you look at the J&J supply chain, I think we have partners across the globe, and what enables us to choose appropriate partners who can do the job well and secure and ensure that we can get that vaccine to people that's safe and effective. The IP allows us to enter into agreements with the right people. And we do have, we have an agreement with a company in India, and we have an agreement with a company in South Africa that are helping us supply globally. And so what we were able to do, because we have control of the IP, is to pick the best companies to help us supply the world. If you were to give everything to everybody, you may see a flood of vaccines, but you would have no idea if they're safe and effective. In fact, I think Brian's probably aware of this, but yesterday they reported on counterfeit Pfizer vaccines showing up in Mexico and Poland. Now, if Pfizer had said everybody can have this, and if they had published everything that they had, how would you know they're counterfeit? So people would be getting vaccines that aren't working, and you wouldn't know it. The way we know it is Pfizer says, wait a minute, I didn't license these people. I didn't allow these people to make this vaccine. So I know these vaccines are counterfeit.
Yeah. So that is such a good point, which is that this is not just any product. It's a complicated product, but more importantly, it's a product that goes into humans' bodies on a mass scale and can have immediate and does have immediate health effects. So obviously that's why the US FDA and other FDAs around the world have taken a lot of time to making sure that the specific vaccines out of the various companies that are authorized are actually safe and efficacious.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me ask Eb, from a venture capitalist point of view, from an investor point of view, what's wrong with the TRIPS, with a waiver proposal? If there, maybe you don't think anything's wrong with it. The reason I ask from an investor's point of view is because your investments have already been made, presumably, not yours personally, but the investment community has already made its investments in these particular technology. They exist, it's done, they're cooked. The vaccines are out on the market, in the marketplace. And some say, look, this is it's a once in a century humanitarian crisis. Why not deal with it now? And you know, what impact could it have, if any, on the future? The investments have been sunk, some argue.
Yeah. So I put it kind of simply, which is, you know, stealing, no matter for what reason, has a negative effect over time, and it has a chilling effect on future activities. So, you know, the J&Js and the Pfizers of the world are, you know, to my knowledge, not trying to profit right now off of this vaccine. They're trying to do everything they can to be good corporate citizens and you know, get the vaccine into as many people's arms as they possibly can. And for investors in a startup, however, they would not be profiting for many years. So yes, their investment would have been made, but they're waiting for the return in the future. And so if a TRIPS waiver, which is the way it's worded, is extremely broad, takes away the ability for them to get any kind of return on that investment in the future, then you know, it's unfair to them in terms of the risk that they took many years ago, and to never see a return on that investment. And then the other is that it'll discourage them from making investments into the healthcare in the future. You know, the thing about investment dollars is that there's no, you know, God, you know, given command or no law that says money must be invested into healthcare. You know, they can just as easily invest in social media, in, you know, retail and restaurant, wherever they want to invest. That is potentially lower risk, but, you know, and lower return, but is, you know, more certain than it is the going after healthcare. So I think that if we just step back and we think about it in the long term, we want to make sure that there is private investment going into all of these areas and trying to develop platform technologies that can be used in many different areas, and you know, taking it once it's been realized that it has value away from them will discourage them from pursuing it in the future.
Thanks, Eb. Brian, let me ask you. Statistics, some statistics indicate that although there's been 1 billion vaccine doses delivered already, something like 90+% have gone to the most developed countries. What do you say about that? Isn't there something to be said for a more equitable distribution around the world? And what other than waiving the IP rights as proposed in this waiver, TRIPS waiver proposal, other than that, what else can we do? First of all, do you agree that something should be done, and then what could it be?
Yes, I think that in lower income countries and lower middle income countries, access and distribution is critical. Equitable access is a key goal of ours. I think that one of the questions I think that's been put forward in the Q&A is, what can U.S. Congress do to help? One thing that Congress might be able to do is help in the distribution of these vaccines in LICs and LMICs, that is lower income countries and lower middle income countries. We're also working through COVAX, and we have direct agreements with many of these countries where we're selling vaccine and providing vaccine at no profit. One of the issues that we face with our own vaccine, I think that is at this point well known, is that it requires cold chain storage and cold chain distribution. That's something that could be a significant challenge in many countries in the world. That's where governments can play a significant role. And there are other ways to help ensure that the vaccines that we manufacture, which we think we can manufacture to supply the world, get distributed equitably. It's a very, very important goal. And that's where I think that governments can help step in. It's really in getting the vaccine to the patients who need it in all of these countries. And that's a challenge. We're seeing that's a challenge in our own country because of vaccine hesitancy in some cases and equitable access in others. And it's that much more so in many of these other countries. It's going to be a huge challenge. Once we get the vaccine on the ground through a plane or other delivery mechanism, it's getting it to the patients. That's where I think one of the biggest challenges will be, and that's where I think many government agencies and entities can really play a role.
So the question that you referred to from the audience actually comes from somebody on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and is asking specifically what can the US Congress do to increase manufacturing capacity and help vaccinate the rest of the world. You referred to distribution, Brian. What about export controls?
Well, export controls might be another avenue. We're open to all options that can help ensure that the vaccine makes it to people who need it. We want to ensure, in terms of supplies of critical reagents, that our supplies remain intact. We're running a very tight supply chain. It's one of the issues with the proposed TRIPS waiver. If we have other manufacturers in small countries attempting to make our vaccine, there's going to be a disruption in supply chain. That's a critical issue for us. So export controls can play a role, but we want to ensure that there is no impact on the supply chain.
Great, thanks. Let me turn to Jayashri. Jayashri, you are a TRIPS expert, lots of experience in this area. First, do you think the waiver would work to achieve its intended result, which is broader dissemination or a more equitable dissemination around the world? And second, what else could we do to get more vaccines out to more people around the world?
Thanks, Andre. So, unfortunately, I do believe that intellectual property is really not standing in the way for this particular case. This is unlike the HIV/AIDS case. A lot of people make this comparison with HIV/AIDS medicines, and the difference is that those were small molecule medicines which could be copied and were being copied in India at the time that Africa was not getting those drugs in time or at very high prices where it was not accessible. This time it's different because these are complex products to make. And so just waiving intellectual property, patents in particular, is not going to help, because how are you going to get the trade secrets? How are you going to get the tacit know-how, except with the cooperation of the originator companies? And we've heard now two of the representatives saying that, look, we don't have the bandwidth to do this in every part of the world, and there would be lots of issues involved. That's the same issue with compulsory licensing. You can't actually use it, not only because of this, what has been said about the political pressures. Even if you were going to do it, it wouldn't help because you couldn't do this on your own. So some have suggested that the US government or the EU that paid the companies in advance should kind of put pressure on these companies to engage in these simultaneous technology transfer projects in several low and low middle income countries, and Latin America and Africa in particular. But I don't think that is really going to work at this time. For me, the immediate solution, because we need an immediate solution. We're not looking for a medium-term solution here or a long-term solution. So for me, the immediate solution, the only one that I can see, is for the rich countries, the countries that have already received and pre-ordered the millions of doses. including those that are in the pipeline of that order, they should immediately donate or sell these doses at affordable prices through COVAX for equitable distribution to vulnerable populations all over. There are currently, according to one estimate, 400 million people in the priority groups in low and middle income countries yet to receive a single dose of vaccine. And that, I think, should be unacceptable to global leadership, to the international community. I do think that adolescents and children in the countries that have the doses already can surely wait a few months longer so that the priority groups are vaccinated all over. But that's just for now. But what about for the future? Because these pandemics are not going away, and even the variants are worrying. I think we really need a predictable, sustainable, and efficient financing mechanism. That's the key. To my mind, it has to be intergovernmental, because COVAX, we've seen, hasn't worked. It's voluntary and it's doing its best, but it's not quite achieving what it set out to do, even though those targets were themselves not very ambitious. So I would say an international pandemic fund along the lines, or taking lessons, drawing lessons from the International Monetary Fund, that I think would facilitate both the development and the equitable global distribution of essential products in future pandemics. That's a brief introduction to a proposal that I have on the International Pandemic Fund.
Now that proposal is more aimed for future pandemics, I guess, right? Not enough time to get to it for this one, right, Jayashree?
Yes, right.
Okay, and back to for that future, is there a role for the Medicines Patent Pool? You're currently a director there. Is there a role in either for the current or any future pandemic for a consortium like that to work and help the more broad distribution, more equitable distribution?
You know, for me, the key is not having a forum such as the Medicines Patent Pool. For me, the key, because it's possible that future products that are needed are also, a lot of them complex to produce and covered by tacit know-how and so on. It's possible that it happens also in the future. So I think the leadership needs to be taken, the international community needs to be led, and it needs to be led by the big economies. And like the United States and the European Union, they need to lead this and say that, look, we are going to pool our resources together. What we did individually this time, we're going to do this together. We're going to find promising winners. We're going to finance them in advance. We're going to allow them to do all of this. But in my mind, the key, what was missed this time, was to think about the rest of the world also, not just your own jurisdictions, but to think about the entire world and to have some conditions on companies that receive these advances, which are needed because you need to do this very quickly. So in addition to the intellectual property, you also need government funding. And I think that funding should come from an international intergovernmental agency like the IPF that I'm suggesting. And it needs to have quick decision-making, which would be like an executive board with weighted voting according to contributions. Now, every country that enters the fund has to contribute upfront, but the weighted voting would really help with efficient and quick, speedy decision-making. And the goal is equitable distribution at the end of it. And I think had we had such a fund in advance, in January 2020, had such a fund started, we could have, by the end of 21, had at least priority populations covered all around the world. I have no doubt about it.
All right, so we're almost out of time. Let me go to one more audience question and pose it to Robert. And that is, the fact is, Jayashree mentioned that we could have had it. Have we done this originally? I'm sure things could have been better, and we can take lessons learned and apply it for the next, God forbid, pandemic. But still, we're on track to deliver 10 billion doses by the end of this year. And so, the question is, how do we ensure the distribution of that in an optimum way? And the audience asks, do you feel that the current IP system was sufficient for optimal collaborations between you and members of the public or other private or industry sectors. The fact is that you do have a lot of collaborations already in place domestically and internationally. But do you think the system's been optimized? Could we do something else in the next few months to help it?
I think Jay Shree hit it right on the nail on the head there. It's the patent system has worked perfectly for coming up with different solutions, many different solutions, many attempts at different solutions. And so we have a lot of opportunity to help people. The question becomes, how do we get those opportunities to people that need them? And that's not an IP question. IP never gets in the way. If it allows you to make decisions, but you don't have to use IP. You can if I can have a patent, I can give it to the whole world. And as Jay Shree said, in this situation, that's not going to help anybody. The issue has been, how do we get these safe and effective medicines that the patent system has generated to people that need them? And so, without IP, it's very hard to have collaboration. Without IP, it's very hard to come up with safe and effective pharmaceuticals that are manufactured and developed around the world. IP helps you do that. The real problem that we're facing, to Jay Shree's point, and I think to everybody's point that has talked about this, is how do you get it out to the people in systems where they don't have access to it? And I do think governments can work with each other to help solve that problem. I think that's a better answer than trying to modulate this complex issue by just destroying patents. That's not going to do anything.
Well, thank you all. This has been a fabulously interesting discussion. I'm sure we could keep going here for hours on end. I want to thank all the panelists, Robert, Brian, Jayashree, and Eb, for your very insightful comments and thoughts and all the work you do in the space. I want to thank Dr. Hamre, Alex, Kirsten, and the whole team at CSIS for enabling this discussion and enabling the very important project of renewing American innovation. And once again, thank you to Senator Coons for his thoughts and his time and attention to this critically important issue, and his leadership on intellectual property matters in the United States and around the world. So thank you all, and have a good rest of the day.